Something important just changed in the Black Sea, and it didn't happen with explosions, breaking news banners, or dramatic footage, because the most decisive shifts in war rarely announce themselves, and while most people are still focused on maps showing slow movement in eastern Ukraine, the real story unfolded quietly around Odessa, a city that hasn't been captured, hasn't been destroyed, and yet has been effectively locked in place, cut off not by soldiers on the streets, but by control of the space around it. And that matters because for nearly 2 years, audiences were told a simple, comforting story that Russia's navy was beaten back, that drones had changed everything, that NATO had found a way to win without fighting directly. But wars don't turn on viral moments. They turn on who controls the sky, the sea, and the choices available to the other side. And without a single amphibious landing or headline-grabbing battle, Russia reshaped the Black Sea so thoroughly that Odessa now exists under constant watch, constant pressure, and constant limits, leaving NATO with strong statements, but no real moves it can make without risking a confrontation it doesn't want. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because Odessa isn't just a Ukrainian city, it's a test case, a quiet demonstration of how modern power works, how a city can be neutralized without being taken, how a region can be controlled without occupation, and how an alliance built for dominance suddenly finds itself constrained by geography, treaties, and escalation risks. And if that can happen here, in a confined sea close to NATO territory, then the question isn't what happens next in Ukraine, but what this reveals about the limits of Western power everywhere else. Because what's unfolding isn't a dramatic collapse, it's something more dangerous, a slow realization that the rules everyone thought they understood no longer apply. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it, which is why understanding how Odessa became a fortress and what that actually means is essential to understanding where this war and the global balance of power is really heading. What just happened in the Black Sea is not being discussed honestly in Western media, and that omission is not accidental. It reflects discomfort, not confusion, because acknowledging what has occurred would require admitting that a central Western assumption about this war has failed. While headlines remain dominated by incremental advances and attritional fighting in eastern Ukraine, a far more decisive strategic shift has unfolded to the south. Quietly, methodically, almost invisibly to the casual observer. Odessa, long portrayed as Ukraine's maritime lifeline and NATO's potential gateway into the Black Sea, has effectively been transformed into a fortress, sealed off not by occupation, but by denial. This development matters far more than the capture of a town or even a city in the Donbass. Odessa is the last major port under Ukrainian control. It represents Ukraine's remaining physical connection to the global economy via the sea. More importantly, it is the hinge point of the entire northern Black Sea balance of power. For months, Western officials and analysts reassured audiences that Russia's Black Sea fleet had been neutralized, that Ukraine had seized the initiative through drones and precision strikes, and that NATO-backed innovation had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. These claims sounded compelling. They were also incomplete, because naval warfare is not decided by viral footage or isolated tactical successes. It is decided by sustained control of space, air, and escalation dominance. And on those metrics, the balance has shifted decisively. Russia did not need to storm Odessa. It did not need a dramatic amphibious assault or a symbolic victory parade. Instead, it employed a far older and more reliable method of warfare, controlling the environment so thoroughly that the opponent's options disappear. Odessa now exists under constant surveillance, layered missile coverage, air dominance, and maritime denial. NATO, constrained by geography and treaty law, has no credible way to reverse this condition without risking a direct confrontation. It is unprepared to escalate, and that raises a deeply uncomfortable question, one that leads us directly into the broader strategic story. If NATO cannot meaningfully contest the Black Sea, what does that reveal about the limits of Western power projection in contested regions worldwide? To answer that, we must first understand why Odessa has always been strategically decisive, and why its fate was never going to be determined by political assurances alone. To understand Odessa's current status, one must understand how Russian strategic culture views geography, not as an abstract concept, but as destiny. Odessa was founded in 1794 under Catherine the Great as part of Russia's imperial project to secure permanent access to warm water ports. For a continental power hemmed in by icebound seas for much of the year, access to the Black Sea has always been existential rather than optional. This logic predates communism, predates NATO, and predates the modern Russian state. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Russian and later Soviet military planning treated the northern Black Sea coast as a unified strategic system. Ports, airfields, shipyards, and coastal defenses were integrated into a single operational space designed to deny hostile navies access while ensuring Russia's own freedom of maneuver. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 fractured this space politically, but not strategically. Russian planners never accepted the notion that the Black Sea would become a Western-dominated body of water. NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was tolerated, if reluctantly. Expansion into Russia's immediate maritime approaches was not. This is where Western analysis often falters. The Black Sea is not analogous to the Atlantic or even the Mediterranean. It is a confined basin governed by the Montreux Convention, which strictly limits the size, duration, and composition of non-Black Sea navies. NATO cannot simply surge carrier groups into the region or maintain permanent dominance. Russia, by contrast, operates from interior lines. From Crimea alone, it can project air power, missile coverage, and naval strike capability across most of the sea. When combined with coastal missile systems, submarines, and layered air defenses, the Black Sea becomes less a contested space and more a controlled one. For years, Western strategy assumed Ukraine could offset these disadvantages through asymmetric means, drones, anti-ship missiles, and selective strikes. These tools were effective tactically. Strategically, they bought time. But time favors the actor with greater industrial depth, escalation control, and geographic advantage. And as Russia adapted, hardened its defenses, and integrated its forces, the window for meaningful NATO influence narrowed. Odessa's strategic environment changed long before most observers noticed, setting the conditions for the present reality. The transformation of Odessa did not occur overnight. It was the cumulative result of sustained pressure applied across multiple domains. First came the gradual constriction of maritime access. Russian exclusion zones expanded. Ukrainian commercial shipping faced rising insurance costs and growing risk. Grain corridors, initially presented as symbols of Ukrainian resilience, became fragile conditional arrangements dependent on Russian restraint rather than Ukrainian control. Second came the systematic degradation of infrastructure. Russian strikes around Odessa were not random acts of terror. They were deliberate efforts to erode the city's military utility, targeting power distribution, logistics hubs, rail connections, and air defense systems. Each strike reduced Ukraine's ability to operate freely from the port. At the same time, Russian naval aviation and reconnaissance assets increased their activity. Surveillance flights became routine. Subsurface operations intensified. The message was unmistakable. This battle space was being shaped, not contested. Western responses remained largely rhetorical. There would be no NATO-flagged convoy escorts, no freedom of navigation operations backed by overwhelming force. Any such move would risk immediate escalation with a nuclear-armed state in a confined theater where reaction times are measured in minutes. As a result, NATO quietly recalibrated its objectives. Odessa ceased to be discussed as an operational hub and became instead a political symbol, something to be supported rather than defended. Russia, meanwhile, treated Odessa as a military problem requiring a military solution. By saturating the region with missile coverage and air dominance, it rendered the port strategically inert without ever crossing the threshold of occupation. This raises a crucial question, one that leads directly into deeper analysis. If a city can be neutralized without being captured, how should we rethink the meaning of control in modern warfare? From a strategic standpoint, the situation around Odessa illustrates a core principle of contemporary warfare. Denial is often more decisive than conquest. Russia does not need to plant its flag in Odessa to achieve its objectives. It merely needs to ensure that the city cannot serve NATO or Ukrainian strategic purposes. That means no secure basing, no reliable logistics, and no uncontested maritime access. This approach reflects long-standing Russian operational thinking, shaped by decades of preparing to counter technologically superior adversaries. Rather than matching NATO ship for ship, Russia has constructed layered defense systems that raise the cost of intervention beyond what Western political systems are willing to bear. Missile ranges overlap, air defenses interlock. Naval assets operate under protective umbrellas. Any NATO intervention would face unacceptable escalation risks for marginal strategic gain. This exposes a deeper flaw in NATO's Ukraine strategy. The alliance excels at signaling and reassurance. It struggles when confronted with geography, treaty constraints, and escalation dominance. The Black Sea is Russia's interior theater. NATO operates at the end of a long and fragile logistical chain. The implication is sobering. Western naval power is not universal. It is situational, contingent, and constrained. And that realization forces uncomfortable questions about other regions where similar denial strategies could be employed. Which brings us to what may come next. Several paths now lie ahead, each carrying distinct risks. The first is consolidation. Russia continues to harden its control over the northern Black Sea. Odessa remains politically Ukrainian but strategically neutralized. NATO adapts quietly and shifts its focus elsewhere. This is the least dramatic and perhaps most likely scenario. The second involves escalation through proxies. Ukraine, with Western support, increases drone and missile attacks on Russian naval and coastal assets. This raises pressure but also invites retaliation against infrastructure, ports, and command nodes. The third and most dangerous path involves miscalculation. A NATO asset operating in support or intelligence roles crosses an implicit red line. Russia responds forcefully.
Escalation accelerates in a confined theater with limited signaling space. In such an environment, nuclear considerations cannot be ignored, not because they are inevitable but because escalation dominance matters. Russia views the Black Sea as core territory. NATO does not. That asymmetry shapes risk tolerance and decision-making. Which brings us to the broader consequences beyond strategy alone. For civilians in Odessa, the city's transformation into a fortress means prolonged uncertainty. Economic activity contracts. Maritime employment declines. Insurance disappears. Daily life continues under constant strategic pressure. Globally, the effects ripple outward. Grain markets fluctuate. Shipping routes adjust. Countries far removed from the conflict experience secondary consequences from decisions made in a distant sea. Politically, NATO's credibility is tested, not by speeches but by outcomes. Allies quietly reassess assumptions about protection and access. Outside the West, observers draw their own lessons about power, patience, and denial. These lessons will not remain confined to Ukraine, which brings us to the final reckoning, but it has been functionally neutralized. NATO's naval strategy in the Black Sea has reached its limits, not because of incompetence but because of structural realities that were ignored for too long. Russia understood these realities from the outset. The West largely did not. The transformation of Odessa marks a strategic inflection point. It reveals the boundaries of Western power projection and the effectiveness of denial-based warfare in constrained theaters. If this analysis challenges prevailing narratives, that is intentional, because serious strategy begins where comforting illusions end. Share your thoughts in the comments. Engage with this analysis, because the future of this conflict and others like it will be shaped not by headlines but by geography, logistics, and the willingness to escalate. And in the Black Sea, those factors now favor Moscow.